Hello and welcome to just another episode of Just Another Space Podcast. I'm Tom Culligan here with my favorite co-host, Clayton Swope, and our special guest today, Alicia Brown, currently the Executive Director of the Commercial Space Federation and former head associate administrator of NASA's Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs. Did I get that right?
We're all still trying to figure out what intergovernmental means, but that's right.
As an acronym, is that a pronounced acronym, or would you just say out every letter?
Say OLIA.
Okay.
Thank you. Great to be here with you guys. Long-time listener.
Years.
It feels like dog years.
Going back years, yeah.
Podcast.
It's been a long time.
Well, we're thrilled to have you for one, your friend, and we've both known you for a long time in various different government capacities. But also, you have such a unique perspective, having been in industry, having been on Capitol Hill, having been at NASA, and now being back on the industry trade association side. So we're looking forward to digging in and getting your perspective on a whole range of things here. What's your favorite job so far, besides your current one?
They're hands down NASA. I mean, it was an incredible experience, just the pace of things going on, the number of missions that we're launching, the number of science things happening all the time. It was just an incredible place to be and an incredible time to be there with the leaders that we had with Senator Nelson. It was, really great to work with him again. And then Pam Melroy and Bob Cabana and later Jim Free. It was just an incredible team and the A-suite to work for.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about your background. I don't think we know each other that well. I looked up your bio before our call, so it sounds like you go way back, maybe in the state of Florida. Wondering if that was where you're from.
Yeah, I am from North Florida, though I mostly grew up in Houston. So kind of always around the space program, though none of my family was involved in it. But my first job out of grad school actually was working for Senator Bill Nelson from Florida. And I like to say that everyone who worked for Bill got a little bit of space on them. He, of course, flew on the shuttle in 1986. And so when I was working for him and shuttle was still flying, during every launch, he would bring all the staff together, all the interns, and we would watch the launch and he would tell you as things were going on, like, this is what it feels like to be in the shuttle at this time. This is what the G's feel like on your body. Now we're at max Q. And so, of course, just because of his personal interest and that we had the Kennedy Space Center, of course, in Florida, it was just something that was the whole office. So we were kind of a space office. And when I started working for him, actually, it was in late 2008, right before the 2008 presidential election. And I was his scheduler. That was my first job out of school. And I will say being a scheduler was the hardest job.
That's the hardest job, right? Like in a congressional office? Like,
yeah.
I just can't imagine doing that job.
But I probably learned the most in that job also of anything else I've had, just watching kind of how he worked things, how he moved through Congress and DC, how he accomplished things was just a huge education. And it was really an important time for space, as you guys know. There were a lot of things happen in space in the early Obama years that, I was kind of right outside the office and watching these things happen and watching, again, how he, moved through and got things done. So when I moved over to policy, actually, I wasn't working on space. I was first working on defense and on veterans policy, but we worked really closely with the space staffers and with the space subcommittee folks. And also, of course, around that time, the shuttle was retiring, and I would say the whole office was really focused on jobs at the Space Coast and what we could do to try to help mitigate the impact there. So I left Bill's Senate office in 2013. I did a couple years working for industry, again, mostly on defense programs. And then in 2015, when Nelson became the ranking member of the full Commerce Committee after Senator Rockefeller retired, I went back to the committee staff to work on space and science policy. And I was there until Nelson lost his 2018 Senate race. Then I worked for Senator Cantwell for a couple years, who took over as the ranking member and then later as chair, until I went to NASA in 2020. I was asked to be one of the first political appointees over the new administration, took on the Legislative Affairs Office, OLIA, where I was until I had to resign on President Trump's inauguration day, and now I'm at the Commercial Space Federation.
Did not want to do space growing up, even though you were kind of exposed to two different key metro areas, if you will, for NASA?
I don't think I ever knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, even when I started college. And I have a stepdaughter now who's starting to think about college. And I'm like, don't worry, I was in grad school before I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. So no, I knew eventually that I wanted to go to DC and work on policy, but it wasn't necessarily about space policy or anything in particular, really.
I think I wanted to be a farmer at some point.
Did you really?
Just kindergarten. I don't think it lasted to first grade. Tom, what about you? Just out of curiosity.
I think I wanted to be.
You want to be a farmer.
I think I wanted to be either. Do you remember Bob Vila, This Old
Oh
House?
yeah.
I
Oh
liked
yeah.
watching This Old House as a
Really?
young kid.
So did I.
Yeah,
Yeah, with my
yeah,
dad.
yeah. I was like, I think I want to go like build houses. So
It's still on. We watch it.
it is, and I still cannot build a house or do basic repairs around a house.
We've gone out of our way to find houses that were built by This Old House when we were in the Boston area.
Really?
You can find them, yeah, or not built, but usually they're renovated. I mean, they're usually old houses that were renovated. I can give you a map, Tom, if you ever want it.
Alicia's like, what are we talking about?
No, I'm like, it's not too late for all of us to pursue our dreams in our next career.
Yeah, that's
That's
true. Yeah,
right.
yeah,
That
yeah.
is
But
exactly.
well,
That's what I
after this
tell
podcast,
myself.
we could start a home building company.
Let's just keep working towards those goals. So I am curious though. So now having been on both I'm partial to the legislative branch, Article 1. President proposes, Congress disposes. You've been on that side, then you're on the administration side. What was most surprising about going over to the executive branch that you wish you knew when you're on the Hill? And what did the people you worked with in NASA who had never worked on the Hill not get about Congress?
I find it interesting that people who haven't worked in Congress before, there's a lot of mystique around Congress and a lot of focus around, really getting into and looking at the minutia of everything Congress says and trying to glean some direction for where they're headed there, like almost to like a little bit overkill, I used to think. But our time at NASA, I thought we had a really great relationship with Congress. It's something that I think the agency's been working on for some time under Jim Bridenstine. I thought he did a really great job of reaching out to Congress. And then Senator Nelson was, of course, he had these relationships going back for 40 years, was a really respected member of the Senate and on space policy. So it was just, again, a really incredible time to be there and be with him because I thought he opened up so many doors on behalf and for the betterment of the agency.
How
That's
did
that's
that work out with the relationship with President Biden? I imagine when Administrator Nelson was a senator, he probably had a pretty close relationship with him. Did that come out in what you saw in how NASA worked? And maybe that's not always how it works if that relationship wouldn't be there.
Yeah, certainly they had a personal relationship from their time in the Senate. And I really think, that's why Senator Nelson ended up at NASA is because the president asked him to serve there. And I do think that that relationship was to the benefit of NASA at times. And also, I certainly wasn't in those conversations in those rooms, so I can't speak with direct knowledge. But my impression was that the president had a lot of trust in Administrator Nelson and his decisions and his vision for the priorities of the agency. And ultimately, I thought that was really beneficial for the agency because Senator Nelson had a lot of scars from his decades and decades around the space industry and so he had a really clear vision of things that were important to him. The bedrock of safety under all the programs, and also about continuity of purpose. We had
yeah.
he, I think, had some scars for what happened in the Obama administration with the cancellation of Constellation. And so, being able to come in and to finally keep on track for the space exploration programs was something I think that was really important to him.
He
Yeah, I
probably
mean,
also got the jobs impact to communities around the country. Someone coming from the state of Florida probably sees that in a way that maybe someone that's coming from a different state or different area would just never know. I'm from Southern Ohio, wouldn't see it. Glenn is in the state, but don't really know what type of jobs are happening up at the Glenn Research Center. But I just can imagine an administrator coming with that perspective, understood that firsthand, bring something to the table that maybe a lot of other administrators just wouldn't necessarily have if it just confined their lives around maybe space policy or some issue that you don't get to see that impact.
I certainly think it helped with his relationship and the agency's relationship with Congress because he very much, he had sat in their seat and understood what was motivating them, which was, upon occasion, parochial issues like jobs. And so, when we had to do difficult things sometimes, like cancel programs that weren't performing, I think he was able to really speak to members of Congress and senators with a lot of empathy because he had been in that position before, certainly when the shuttle retired.
so I heard a story that he wasn't really seeking the NASA administrator job. He was actually maybe trying to get somebody else in, and President Biden said, no, no, yeah, I don't want to tell you. Can you share that story?
Yeah, I mean, it's really his story to tell, but you're on the money. I think he had turned them down, in fact, but then, really felt like if the president, has asked me to serve, he has a long history of public service, then it's my duty to step up and serve. And I
I
really
think
do think he was, a great person, great time and great place for him to take that role.
that's really cool. And he didn't need to do it right at that point in his career. He could have done a lot of different things after leaving the Senate, and really admirable that he came back and devoted kind of that chapter of his career for this. And it's funny. I gave a talk not that long ago, and it's sort of remarkable. We should go back to what you said. We've now had a fairly consistent space policy since 2010, since the Approach-Sinoth bill in 2010 after the cancellation of Constellation. And so you've been through Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden, now Biden back to Trump. We'll see what happens with this budget request, but it's really unique to have that many changes in power, and not to mention all the congressional majorities that have changed, and have that consistency around, we're going to go back to the moon, we're going to go there kind of in this strategic way, very much way. And I think the progress we've made, and the reason we haven't seen things start to collapse, is that constancy of purpose that you mentioned, that I know your old boss and you were a big part of championing. Was that hard to do, kind of going in and taking a Trump, I'm using air quotes here, Trump administration program, and you show up on the first day of your new job and the Biden administration say, hey, the thing that they were doing before, we're going to keep doing that? Was that a difficult sell, or did the administration get it?
The early days of an administration, or at least in my experience, were kind of wild times. Before there's a confirmed administrator and confirmed political leadership, you're not really sure, or at least in our case, we weren't necessarily given a lot of direction about this is what the administration's priorities are in space. In fact, the Biden-Harris team, I think, or the administration had broad interests that they had put out, like Build Back Better and climate. And at the time, the very couple political appointees were at the agency, we were trying to tell the story of NASA within those priorities to the administration to say, this is why you should care. Actually, it's a funny story. Again, we hadn't had an administrator and we didn't have a budget request. So it wasn't necessarily clear what the priorities were going to be. But kind of early in the administration, the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, got a question from a reporter about the Artemis program and what the administration's views are. And I think the press secretary didn't answer at the time, but came back the next day and said, I've learned about the Artemis program, where we're going to land the first woman on the moon. It sounds great. We're behind it. And that was really the only signal that we got early on that things were going to continue on and that there would be continuity. But yeah, there was a lot of, concern that the people that were there on day one, we were hopeful that there was going to be continuity because we knew a bit about this history. But we hadn't had that direction until we got the budget request for that year.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, to the point of actually my very first day at the agency, a human landing system contract, which was kind of the next big piece of the Artemis program, was supposed to be awarded very soon. And on my first day, the head of the HEO mission director at Human Exploration told us that she needed to delay the announcement of the award. And there was no there. It was like finishing up contracts and paperwork. But I was so worried, or we were so worried, that this was going to be a signal that, they're delaying the human landings and therefore all of Artemis is in question. And we were just very worried about what would that signal to the broader community by delaying that contract.
So was that contract then issued before the administrator was confirmed then? And it was kind of in that period that you're talking about where there was that uncertainty?
That was a little controversial.
Yes. So if you recall, NASA had been planning to select 2 human landing systems. And what came down early in 2021 was that there wasn't enough money to select 2, so the agency selected 1 with SpaceX. And this happened actually a couple days before Senator Nelson's confirmation hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee. And of course, Maria Cantwell was the ranking member at the time. Of course, she has some parochial equities within Washington State that really cared about this award. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with lawyers and procurement experts about, what he was potentially going to be asked to do and with the contract and what was legal or not. So yes, it made for very interesting, fun times for me personally.
Well, and you had been working for Cantwell immediately prior, probably advocating for 2 providers.
You're
And then
right.
to be on the other side now defending the selection of 1. I've never been in that role where I've had to change hats that quickly on a policy thing. So was that difficult, particularly with your old boss, or?
It was difficult, and it was difficult also because Senator Nelson wasn't, of course, in the seat yet. And he wasn't necessarily going to do something like make a promise in order to get confirmed. So it was a very tricky dance that he had to weave. I think he ended up doing it, very well. Turns out, of course, he also really thought that having 2 human landing systems was important. And once he and Pam were in place, they did go ahead and do another competition. But it just wasn't very clear how that was going to happen, or even, what Nelson and Colonel Melroy thought thought about it at the time. So it was very tricky and interesting. And I really think by grace of Senator Nelson's relationships, his personal relationships in the Senate, it would have been maybe even trickier of a confirmation hearing.
Yeah, you do tend to see, I think someone told me John Tower, Senator Tower, was the last senator nominated for a position that didn't get confirmed. And so it is interesting to see the deference that other senators tend to give to senators.
Was
I
that,
think Senator, it
Tom?
was
When
like
was that?
I want to say it was like, was it Reagan or was it Bush
And
one?
what was
I mean,
the role, if you remember?
Tower, I think he was senator from Texas. He was up for, I want to say, SecDef.
Really?
And my understanding is his colleagues really didn't like him. So it was sort of a payback vote, but I'm sure some listeners will remember that, obviously a little bit before my time and know more of the backstory.
I hope there are
kind of,
older people listening to the show
according to
who
our
would remember that.
demographic metrics, we do have a
Okay.
diverse range
Many
of
times I've
ages.
wondered if there are younger people listening to the show.
Only
Maybe.
your children, Clayton.
Well, there's sometimes some not great language for the children on the show.
Only
Remember,
on
Tom?
one episode,
One episode so far.
until
Yeah.
Alicia really like unloads and starts dropping, all
No, I
sorts of stuff.
appreciated the
F-bombs and
disclaimers on that episode. I was like, oh, I'm
yeah.
gonna put my headphones for this
There's a
one.
button. There's a button you click for that when you upload the podcast.
And so another historic first, I think, because we love space history here, Alicia, is during your time at NASA, you had the first all-astronaut trifecta between Bill Nelson, Colonel Melroy, and Bob Cabana. Is that right? In NASA
As
leadership?
far as I know, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So how was that? Was that, I mean, astronauts known for having a certain amount of swagger and commanding a room. Was that a lot of personality for one A suite, or was that a pretty good team?
You know, they each were incredibly respectful of each other. And like, I think they each knew this is what my specialty is, and kind of, led all as a team. They had lunch together every day where they would talk about issues. So, I mean, I thought it was really an inclusive environment, and one that was just, they were all very respectful of each other. And they really engendered kind of that atmosphere throughout the A suite, throughout the ninth floor, and I think throughout the agency. All of them being astronauts or people who've flown in space, it just made even more of a commitment, I think, to safety as kind of the core of NASA's human spaceflight programs and across NASA's missions. The NASA Remembrance Days were always extremely poignant. These were people that they knew personally, that they had trained with. And it just really, it was more than one day. It was something that we talked about and thought about all the time because of their experience, in the astronaut office or within human spaceflight.
That's pretty unique and impressive.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think the last time we had an astronaut as administrator.
Well, Charlie Bolden.
Charlie Bolden, you're right. And he was the first, I think.
I think you're right, yeah. At one point, I had done research on all the administrator nominees, and I knew them all very well, but now it escapes me.
You can name them in order, right? It's like the planets, you got some. Yeah. So as you look back at your time both on the Hill and at NASA, are there certain stories or things that you did that stand out to you as like the most iconic or the things you're most proud of that you got done?
Oh, that is a tough question. I mean, at NASA, not necessarily something that I personally did, but that we were involved in promoting. Of course, the Artemis 1 launch was probably the coolest thing that I got to witness in my time there. In the Senate, going back to this conversation we were having about continuity, as we did NASA authorization bills over my time there, first the 2017 transition bill, and then later we passed a bill through the full Senate in December of 2020, which was again another essentially a continuity bill. Eventually that bill became the NASA authorization of 2022. I think those are the things that I'm, most proud of. I think that they were impactful and symbolic to keeping us on this current pathway to the moon and then on to Mars. I will add in that the bills that actually I really liked working on were the commercial space bills, because it felt like those were kind of most impactful to this new industry, that, the things that you were working on really did matter to whether or not an industry was going to fail or succeed. And that's a big reason that I wanted to come to the Commercial Space Federation at my time at NASA. Is it just, there hasn't been a commercial space bill actually since the one we passed in 2015. So almost 10 years.
That's kind of wild. Yeah.
I know. And the industry has obviously really progressed, and we're kind of stuck still in some of these old ways of doing business and how commercial spaces launch and reentry is licensed and remote sensing. It's just, there's really, I think, a need to kind of update some of these regulatory regimes. Maybe, this mission authorization question is one we've been talking about for a long time. How do you license new and novel missions that aren't unregulated? Those are
You're
kind of
getting Clayton excited over there. This is his favorite topic.
Yeah. So now I'm like, I wanted to come to CSF so that hopefully we can make progress finally on some of these issues.
Should I go there, Tom? Okay. Alicia, I will say you did bring up mission authorization. So, one thing that I've heard for a long time, potentially a decade, is that not having mission authorization, and just for folks that don't know what that is, it would be any activity that you could think of happening in space that falls through the cracks of a regulatory framework right now. So we're looking at things that might involve spectrum and the Federal Communications Commission, that's regulated. Things like launch, that's regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. Reentry is regulated by FAA. So things that aren't, asteroid mining. We had someone that does asteroid mining on our show. I was about to say call again. It's a show. I've heard that without that, there's we're holding back investment in some of these commercial space ideas. What's your thought on that? I mean, it's something again I've often heard. I guess I'm like, would we have talked with folks from companies like that? I don't get the impression that they're saying we're held back by that, and that we definitely seem to be growing leaps and bounds with investment in commercial space, and it's certainly gotten up to the point where it has been some of those higher tide points for investment in space today. So it doesn't feel like we're held up or we're stuck or we're on a downswing. So that's just one thing, and maybe I'll just confine my mission authorization pontification on that. And just Alicia, your thoughts from where you are now at CSF about how not having that might be holding back investment in commercial space.
I certainly have heard that before as well. What I can say is I think a lot of the industry or a lot of the companies that are doing some of these novel activities that don't have a clear regulatory pathway, I think they very much are seeking some certainty to know that they can get approval for their missions. We've seen that the federal government has been able to kind of cobble together some processes, but I think that they're just seeking clarity in what those processes are. The default also that in some of these new areas is that NASA kind of ends up as, certifying missions. And I don't think that's a place NASA wants to be in the future. And also just the processes that we've cobbled together through the payload review process at FAA, it doesn't necessarily cover everything that the federal government might like to be able to look at as we look at these missions. And so an interesting example actually was last year's the first CLIPS mission that Astrobotic did. Unfortunately, it didn't make it all the way to the moon, but it raised this interesting policy question because it turned out that there was human cremains on the mission. And there was a concern raised by the Navajo Nation that landing human cremains on the moon was offensive or not consistent with it was their religious beliefs, something like that. And at the time, we at NASA got a lot of calls about this, and I was like, "Hey, NASA's buying this as a service. It's not a NASA
Yeah.
mission. It's a commercial mission. And so go call the FAA. But I guarantee you they're gonna say is we have no ability to have a mission based on that. That's not something we can look at. The regulatory framework that FAA has is does this impact public safety? It doesn't necessarily look at things like, our international obligations or even, other national interests. So I think, finally addressing this solves a few problems. It does give industry some certainty into what the process looks like. And then it can also, for the federal government's perspective, can ensure that we're going to protect, national security equities, maybe other missions or other things that the federal cares about, like ensuring we continue to have a sustainable space environment to operate in.
So I'm glad you brought up that example because I think it's one of the most fascinating intersections of space policy in the last couple of years is little did you know that you would be researching like Indian treaties with the Navajo Nation as it pertains to the commercial launch of a NASA contracted lunar, lander system. I mean, how was that? Like, were you talking to Interior and I think is it the Bureau of Indian Affairs and on how to.
Yep, and the Department of Transportation. Of course, for my day to day, we were getting calls from the Hill about what is our role here? How did this happen? I did really learn that time where I told everyone intergovernmental affairs does not mean that I deal with the Indian nations. That's someone else's job. But actually, it was very unclear within NASA whose role it was to even have those communications. So, yeah, it was kind of a crazy few days. It ended up being sort of a moot point, but I do think that it really emphasized that, again, there needs to be a federal agency that's maybe looking at these things for those kind of concerns.
Was that
And I,
resolved in the end? Like, did you have an agreement with the Navajo Nation on how to handle that
I
going
guess it was
forward?
resolved when the astrobotic mission didn't work. Sorry,
Right.
I
They
said it.
brought it back to Earth, and yeah.
I think that at least we figured out good pathways of communications with Native nations within NASA. But again, NASA was putting our own instruments on that. It wasn't a NASA mission, so it wasn't NASA's responsibility to look at every other payload going on to the CLIPS missions.
And I won't ask Alicia you this question, but to me, this is like you, Tom. I think this is super interesting. What happened? But if there was a process for authorization, regulation, whatever that would look like, I wonder what would have been the outcome then? Would it have been to deny that company the right to use the astrobotic for taking cremains to the moon? If that was the outcome, it might have suggested that that is actually going to hamper commercial activity on the moon by saying, no, you can't do that. We're going to close that business case. If it allowed it, I don't know if that still would have then clarified, at least in this case, if that's allowed or not allowed. It still would have left that probably bad feelings with the travel communities that had this issue with this activity because it would have permitted it. So in my mind, in either path, it would have had an outcome where it either hampered that commercial activity or it still made the travel communities upset. So I don't know what it was. I don't know if the fix means we hampered that. I'm not asking you a question, Alicia. Trust me. I'm opining. But just, I guess it goes back to, what's the raison d'etre of having mission authorization, even though I do think this is a fascinating example of something where it's like, oh, I had no idea um, there are human remains on that spacecraft. I didn't ask, I didn't know there was no box to check on the paperwork that said you had human
Right.
remains.
I mean, ultimately, I think it depends on what the statutory authority is given to an agency to review licenses and how narrow or not that authority is.
Yeah, it's I think about the Artemis missions and kind of where we're going on the moon, whether they're commercial or government led. That's this stuff is going to come up more and more. And I am curious. I don't to the extent that Apollo, NASA even consulted with the Navajo Nation or any other tribes back then about sensitivities, or that was even on their radar or something to care about. I know certainly for the tribes, and their religion and cultural experience, this has a lot of meaning and impact, and we have treaty obligations with them, and they are citizens of this country. So it's funny. I always tell people like there's a space angle to everything, and I guess now there's an Indian affairs angle to space. If you just look hard enough, you're going to find it. The other thing I want to chat about on the mission authorization part, and this is, I think, a lot of people outside of our very nerdy space world might not realize, is that under the Outer Space Treaty, the U.S. government takes responsibility from a financial and maybe broader security implications for any activity in space. And so beyond whatever insurance requirements are required as part of a launch license, that's really the only protection the taxpayer, the government has against full indemnification and assuming of the liability of. So let's say you launch something, and I remember this happened with a provider a few years ago. They actually launched without a license. Was it Swarm? Does that sound right?
That's right. I do recall that.
Yeah. And then, in doing so, then, that was a clear violation of the license, and I think they got penalized. But, even if you do have a license and, we get these newer entrants coming in, it's kind of remarkable. We're really taking a big vote of confidence in people that, hey, my system, whatever I'm launching, is going to stay intact. It's going to go where it needs to go. I'm counting on it not hitting the Chinese space station or a Russian Soyuz, or I feel like that's one of the things that most members of Congress and staff don't even realize that government's on the hook for.
Suppose, Tom, but where would that lawsuit take place? The UN, there's a violation of the OST. I mean, to me, from a legal standpoint, I hear you, but it's like I put air quotes around international space law just because there's no court that you take claims for OST violations to. So I get it if something was like, well, the US isn't living up to its obligations under OST. Well, what is the court where that would be adjudicated?
Yeah, it's never been tested, but I mean, I think we want to be careful about, we want other nations to be acting, and have oversight of their industries to ensure that they're acting in responsible ways in space. And so it's almost, a US leadership thing, lead by example, by setting up a regime
Yeah, that's fair.
where we're
Yeah. Yeah. I remember there was an administration before you were in there, Alicia, talking about pulling out of the Outer Space Treaty. And I was like, or there was some discussion, we'll put some rumblings, and you're going, boy, you start pulling that thread. It might be hard to put things back together. And I think they ultimately came to that conclusion, at least maybe the faction that was toying around with that idea. But we're in an interesting moment right now. And I know the U.S. is not party to the Moon Treaty, or whatever we call it, agreement. Yeah. I mean, Clayton, this is your domain. You know this stuff inside.
We don't
and
have to
out.
go down this rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Trust me,
yeah,
Tom.
yeah. No, but I find it really interesting because, and I don't want to get into space law stuff, particularly, Alicia, given your background working with government agencies and now working with a lot of, I would say, I don't even call some of your members new entrants because they've been around 20-something years now, but you do have a number of new entrants within your CSF membership. And it's getting busier than ever. And, busy is good from an economic and probably from a U.S. leadership standpoint. Busy also comes with new dynamics, under treaty obligations or nation to nation power dynamics that we haven't experienced. We haven't
Or new
had to
ideas, new
new ideas.
business
Yeah,
ideas? Yeah, I'm curious too.
all the
Yeah,
above.
what crazy ideas, not crazy in a bad sense, but just, breaking barriers in ways that Tom talked about too, but just maybe with ideas to do new things in space businesses. What's coming across your radar now?
I mean, so many things. You guys had the folks from BARDA on, I think, a
Uh-huh.
couple weeks ago. The promise there of doing some of the pharmaceutical manufacturing in space is just crazy cool, like, building on some of the things that we've already done at International Space Station there. We've been hearing for years also about in-space manufacturing of things like optical fibers. There's so many different use cases out there. I'm sure so many that we haven't even thought of yet. And just the idea to me that, the opportunities that that is going to provide and the economic growth that's going to give the United States, I think is just really exciting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It feels like in talking to Varda and Astroforge, it feels like the new generation, and they seem to all start around 2020. They really have learned from the prior generations of startups that didn't make it about how do you find no kidding real near term or immediate addressable market rather than speculative market based on perceived future government demand or subsidies. And I think that's a really exciting shift in when we talk to those folks about how they're viewing, I remember I think all three of us lived through the prior planetary mining boom, of a decade ago. And it was very like, if you build it, then the government will buy it. And then if the government buys it, then, and obviously that didn't pan out. Now it seems to be like, look, we've got capital independent, we've got commercial demand independent. And that's kind of exciting.
Well, not only that, but at the time around 2015, I think, when those first companies were around, they were adamant that they needed legislation saying that, they legally could go take resources off of a celestial body, adamant that their businesses would not succeed unless they got this legislation. And they were a bit strong arming of the committee staff and the members about doing it. And we did ultimately put that in the legislation. And then, of course, those two companies for pushing that ended up going bust. It is interesting now to see kind of this second cycle of people with the same business model.
There's also it's the same legislation really for deep sea mining, allowing US companies to do that. But there's absolutely no US companies right now that are doing deep sea mining. I just want to point that out too. It's a similar case where that's because we're not a part of oh man, it's an acronym. UNCLOS, the UN, I don't even know what
Laws
it
of the
is
sea?
anymore. Something laws of the sea, a
Yeah.
convention on the laws of the sea, right? And then the International Seabed Authority is what is the organization within that does the regulation of seabed mining. But because we're not part of that treaty, we're not part of that organization that issues licenses. So again, a scenario where U.S. companies, I would imagine at the time, must have asked for legislation that specifically said they could do deep sea mining, but no one's actively doing that. No one's
And
actively
this is the
doing that.
perfect time to announce our new podcast, just another undersea podcast looking at deep sea mining.
I always laugh that there's a lobby in DC for absolutely everything. And what you're telling me is there's a lobby in DC for a business that no one's seeking to do.
I think a U.S. company said we were interested in doing it, but then that U.S. company is like, I don't know, we're not going to do it now. There's too much uncertainty. But I can only think of one.
We're going to
Well,
inspire somebody
folks
on
like us in
this.
business, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was
Well,
wondering, just looking kind of forward, maybe just thinking what you've seen in the past few years when you were at NASA, when you worked on the Hill, but now an interesting perspective too, seeing what companies want to do, both for the government and then these ideas that maybe don't have the government as a core customer. Going to the moon, going to Mars, going to deep space, competition with China, not just from a geopolitical standpoint between the US and China, but from a business standpoint. Going back to that asteroid mining company that we had on an early episode, the only other company wanting to do that is a company from China that has the same goal to make money from mining asteroids. So how does the dynamics with the US and China, how do all these different activities, both from the government wanting to do them, companies wanting to do them, how does that influence what you see maybe changing in the way that we were looking at things like Artemis, things like doing deep space exploration? Are we going to see like a CLIPS, commercial lunar services, or commercial, what is it?
payload
Lunar
services.
payload services. Are we going to see an initiative like that where we're looking at deep space missions? So just I think there's a lot of stuff in there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of those.
Yeah. Let me try to add a few things in here that The commercial companies, a lot of them are still doing business with or want to do business with the federal government. And I think that the benefit to the federal government is that, budgets in this area, particularly in non-defense accounts, are not going up. So in partnering with more of these commercial companies who are more interested in, they're putting their own skin in the game, they're willing to do these firm fixed price contracts. What we've seen, I think, in NASA's case is that means that a dollar can go a little bit further, that, we can build out this robust architecture around the moon in a way that we need to have a sustainable program, even though the budgets aren't necessarily rising. So I think hopefully we do see more of that. Hopefully there are more programs that it's a big vote of confidence, I think, to investors or other potential customers when the government does kind of do an initial procurement here. Eclipse is a really good example. It's obviously a really kind of unknown time within space policy with the new administration. And it's really hard for me now to predict what's going to come, especially as they don't have an administrator confirmed. We haven't seen a budget request. Of course, the president has mentioned Mars. Does that mean that the administration is going to turn away from going to the moon? I think we really don't know. And it is just a crazy time because I think historically in a new administration, the first year when the first budget comes out, it's usually kind of a status quo, and you usually see those big changes in the second year. But that might, I suspect that might not be the case sometime. We might see some, major shifts being proposed quickly here as we see the FY20.
I mean, that's kind of funny, thinking, Tom, to our podcast we had with Mike French, former NASA chief of staff, who was talking about the space crisis that they immediately delivered to President Obama. And it strikes me as, I don't know if we're going to have a space crisis now, but I totally agree with you, Alicia. There's so much up in the air right now we just don't have answers for. I think there's the makings of a similar dynamic that could roll Congress in addition to other space stakeholders that have strong opinions about these issues. I think it could have the same, you could say, kindling. I'm not going to say the fire is going to be the same, but I see that now. But again, crisis, I'm not going to say the impending crisis. I think that was a quote about the run up to the Civil War. Someone made a quote about the impending crisis. I don't think that's where we are, but I do feel like the foundations for that are kind of there like they were for the start of President Obama's administration.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting to see already, the two chairmen of the NASA oversight committees in the House and the Senate are both from Texas. And of course, the Republicans are in charge of both the House and the Senate, so of the same party. And you've already seen them kind of lay out what their priorities are, that they do very much support going back to the moon in the Artemis program. And of course, they also have huge equities in the ISS as it's managed out of Houston, out of Johnson. And so you see this as kind of an area where right now maybe Congress isn't pushing back against a lot of things happening or that the administration is proposing, but I wonder if space is actually going to be one of those areas.
And I mean, I feel like I'm going to guess this right. In 2009, I'm going to guess Democrats controlled the Senate and the House right when. So it's a similar
Super majority
dynamic
in the
there
Senate.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a huge, people forget it was a huge majority. And what was interesting working for the chairman on the House side of the subcommittee that funded NASA, the number of Democratic members that were coming up to us on the Republican side, you have to stop this. I can't say it, but I need you to stop this. And so, and people forget that it was actually, Alicia, your committee under Senator Nelson and Senator Rockefeller, two Democrats, that issued, as far as I know, the only time the party that had the majority in the Senate and had the White House subpoenaed an administration of the same party over, I would say, probably inappropriate activity that a certain leader at NASA was getting into at the time around cancellation and some of the motivations around that. So,
And
yeah, you could. I mean, now they
starting the SLS program and implementing the law as it had been passed was the concern.
Yeah, and here we are, talking about impoundment and talking about. I saw some back and forth in the news today around Senator Susan Collins, the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, saying, "Hey, we carried a provision in the CR that basically said you have to comply with the spending as directed in here." So saying that. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this play out. I mean, as a bunch of poli-sci nerds, we're gonna enjoy that part of it. But
hey, I'm a mechanical engineer.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry to loop you in. Yeah, that's not fair.
Space nerd.
Alicia, I'm assuming you're a poli-sci.
International affairs, actually. But Clayton, you're a longtime Hill staffer, so don't.
I'm not really an engineer. Yeah, no way. Yeah, I can't.
You can't
just
call
threw that
yourself
in
an
there.
engineer.
No, I can't. I couldn't.
It's like having an honorary PhD, right?
I don't think I can do algebra at this point, but
certainly not how they teach math these days. My kindergartner has math that I can hardly understand sometimes.
It's scary.
I'm a year from that with also having a kindergarten. We'll see what happens next year. I'm sure I'll be in the same boat.
Well, we like to do a lightning round before we wrap up of just a few quick fire questions if you're game for it, Alicia.
All right, let's do it.
Number one, I have to
Number one,
ask,
wait, Tom, we're going to try to ask ones where we don't get you fired. We should.
Much
That,
appreciated.
who's your favorite member company at CSF? No. We already know who your favorite boss is because you worked for him twice, so or 3 times.
Yeah.
I think number one is, sometimes as a staffer writing a bill or an amendment or whatever, you might sneak in an inside joke or do phrase things in a certain way that are
an
only known
Easter
to
egg?
you,
Don't they
an
call that?
Easter
Is
egg.
that
Yeah,
an Easter egg?
exactly. Did you ever put an Easter egg just for you or your staff or the office in a piece of legislation?
No. And I actually hate people that try to be cute with like acronym titles of bills. Like the amount of time people spend on that is just ridiculous, I think. I like boring titles, boring text.
Just the NASA authorization or the commercial,
Yeah, we don't need to
launch
be cute.
app. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Good enough. We
That's
cleared that
actually
up.
what I get advice usually from folks if I'm writing a report or an op-ed or anything. Don't be too cute. People won't know what it is. Say what it is. It may sound boring. It may have what in it, how, why, might end in a question mark, but people are going to know what it is. They're going to click on it. And the Google search algorithm, it's going to find it. If it's too cute and it's some weird acronym, it's never going to find that.
I mean, I was the opposite. I love coming up with a great acronym. I mean, honestly,
No one
it's
knows what it is, though.
yeah, that's true. No, 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 no. And now with Chat GPT and AI, I feel like you could go to town on some of
Oh,
this,
that's true. You could.
you
That's
know.
true.
But all right, so that's all right. Favorite space memory. I know you mentioned the Artemis 1 launch. Is there anything else that stands out to you throughout your career, not just your time at NASA?
I would say also the moment or the event where we unveiled the JWST first images. We did it at Goddard, and they were just after all the promise and issues with that program for so long. It was kind of an incredible moment to see those beautiful images.
That's pretty cool.
I'll add
Yeah,
also, I guess, taking the Artemis 2 crew around the hill. That was just one of the best days I had at work. Members of Congress, most of them day to day don't care about space, but everywhere those people, those guys were treated like, the astronauts, rock stars that they are. It was just really cool to see so much enthusiasm for space and, America. And it was just a really great day.
You mentioned having a kindergartner. I was just wondering, how does he or she look at space? Is it something wants to get into or not, or doesn't know yet? I ask because, mine, I don't know if you could see it in the back. Our podcast listeners won't be able to see, but that's a rocket in my son's room, a rocket ship. That both of my kids, they point to the sky and they point to the moon, and it's always like, "That's the moon. How are we going there? Rocket ship. Do you want to ride in my rocket ship to the moon?" And I'm just surprised because I feel like I don't talk about space that much with them, but that they have this fascination with it and interest. They want to be a part of it. They want to live on the moon. To me, that's just really exciting to hear toddlers talk like that. And again, I think I earlier said I think I wanted to be a farmer at that age, and to hear them talking about space, just I like it a lot.
Yeah. Mine currently wants to be a professional basketball player. And if you know me, I'm 5'2", and I think he's gonna take after me. So I feel for him in that. To him, I think space is just like a part of his everyday life. He's always wanting to go out with me and look at the stars and use the app to look at the constellations. Obviously, he's been privileged to meet astronauts, but I think he doesn't realize how special that is. But it is pretty cool. Every now and then I'll go to his school and read a book and bring NASA stickers, and all the kids are just so fascinated and so excited and into space. So yeah, he does really like it a lot, and I think it's just he doesn't understand maybe that there's a world where you don't get to learn about space
Right.
at his age.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
And we're hardcore Team Pluto in this family.
all right. I
Same.
agree. I
Proselytizing.
Same.
agree.
Same. There's 9
What
planets. Sorry. Sorry,
I
haters.
was I was
Can't
going to
do it.
ask you about unfinished business, but I think that actually might be your unfinished NASA and legislative business, restoring Pluto.
Yeah, I didn't work on that while I was there, and now I guess you're making me feel bad that I didn't. Yeah,
Who controls the planets? Like who in the government decides,
it's like an international body, I think.
I mean,
you know,
if the president's willing to make it the Gulf of America, I think we should petition President Trump to bring back Pluto.
This is the most important thing we as a community
I
could have
think he
done.
should
these are
consider
the
that. I
these are
hope
the
he's
things.
listening to this podcast.
Yeah, he
Make
definitely
Pluto
he
great again.
definitely is. Much like both of your children, they're definitely listening to
They're
this
listening to this, right?
podcast
They
and
listen. They
learning.
download
Yeah.
it later.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, understood. Well, we like to wrap up the episode with a little bit of space history from this week in space history. So, Alicia, if you'll indulge us, Clayton's got actually some really interesting ones this week.
Bad. Yeah, it wasn't
Yeah,
bad. So, I
yeah.
mean,
Number 2 is really interesting.
yeah, I'll just start with that because that is. Oh no, that was yesterday. Shoot, March 27th, 1968. I mean, Downer, but Yuri Gagarin was killed, and he was killed in an accident, an aircraft accident. He was the first human into space. So, fairly significant milestone. And then, a life, I would imagine, fairly cut short there. 1968. America hadn't even landed on the moon yet. And
I'm
he
That is
died in a
surprised
plane
amazing.
that,
crash.
Yeah.
bubble wrapped him and, kept him preserved for all time, and I can't believe they let him get into a fighter jet.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. Yep, I guess they did.
I heard a story, and I don't know if this is true, so the audience is, if they're listening, is going to correct. But that he actually, there was a mission they deemed unsafe, and they wouldn't let him fly it. Does that sound right? Yeah, I
I
don't.
don't know. Obviously, it wasn't just getting in a
But
fighter plane,
the,
right?
the plane was
A
the
big
problem.
trainer, it says. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I thought this was interesting. I was trying to figure out what actually happened now when I was researching this one. It's Mariner 10. Mariner 10 was the first spacecraft to perform flybys by multiple planets, and it was Venus and Mars. It wasn't the first to either, and it wasn't launched today. Actually, okay, it's tomorrow, March 29th, 1974. It flew by Mercury. So there's a Mercury flyby
There's
in
a couple
1974.
planets there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a long time ago. I mean, that's pretty cool that we were doing that then.
But the success of the early space program, always blows my mind, and the fact that Voyager is still out there,
Right.
beyond the solar system, just with, 1960s and 70s technology is just crazy to me.
No, it's great. And like a cell phone battery, like after a year, it won't even
Yeah.
charge. It holds like 15% of the charge. You have to charge it
Yeah.
every 5 minutes. And then Voyager is still working. I mean, it's just crazy.
They don't make them like they used to.
They don't.
That's true.
Well, I think that's as good a place as up. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us and being on the episode. We enjoyed talking to you and appreciate all you do. And we'll be back next week.
Thanks for having me, and keep it up. I think this podcast is exactly what the space industry needed. We're loving it.
I'm glad to hear